You know, the story that we talked about on Sunday is one of my favorite stories in Matthew, where it's talking about Jesus, actually the disciples, feeding the 5,000, which is actually a lot more than 5,000. It's 5,000 men, so we're talking about feeding 10,000 people. But what we forget about is, first off, is they weren't expecting a crowd, and they weren't expecting this at all. In fact, they had just found out that their close friend, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, had just been beheaded by Herod. So they were actually all in places of great stress. They were grieving. They were pretty wiped out. And so they decided to go, Jesus decided to go in a boat and go find a place where there was no one at, in a very remote place. So they went to this very remote place across the lake. And when they got there, people had figured out where Jesus was going to. And there was literally thousands of people waiting for them. And they weren't healthy people. They were sick people. And Jesus looked at them. And this wasn't his plan at first. Was his goal to go to a remote place. Now there's thousands of people. But he had compassion on them. And when he had compassion on them, he began healing all the sick. So disciples, they were all working and organizing. You can imagine that large of a group of people. The crowd probably just kept building and building. And over time, the disciples started realizing, this is a long ways out. And these people took a long time to get there. They don't have food. They're not going to make it back, and there's no places for food around here. And so they go to Jesus and said, we have to stop, and we have to send them back right now because they're not going to make it. They saw this need. They were alerted to this need, and they began thinking, this is what the solution is, to send them back to the villages and let the people get some food and let some people feed them. And Jesus said, no, don't send them away. Here's this moment when you think about being disciples, what this must have felt like. He says, don't send them away. And he looks at him and he says, you feed them. And if I was a disciple, I'd think, did he just say what I thought he said? And so you're looking at probably 10,000 people on this hill, and you're saying, you feed them? And so they make sure Jesus is clear. He says, we've checked this out, how much food we have. We've done a little research. We got 5 loaves of barley bread, and we have 2 small fish. And that's it. And so Jesus gives them the next step. He says, bring it to me. Bring the fish and bring the bread to me. And then he tells this crowd to sit down, which actually wasn't the crowd. He told them to sit down. He actually told the crowd to sit down, but that meant the disciples. So you understand what this would have felt like. The disciples had to get everybody's attention, 10,000, and organize and get 10,000 people sitting down, preparing. So now here we have the expectation is now growing. And so why are we doing this? And they're thinking there's something going to happen, and the disciples are thinking to themselves, Jesus said that we were going to feed these people. And so they get them all organized. Now imagine what it'd be like. The disciples is they go to Jesus, and you think, well, if I was them, I would turn my back on the 10,000, and I would just be looking at Jesus. And so he blessed what little food they had, and then here they are, imagine 12 disciples around Jesus. And then he takes this barley loaf, which is about the size of a softball, breaks in half. So everybody gets less than a half a loaf of bread and a tiny, tiny piece of fish. And then they have this little tiny piece in their hand. Now imagine this. And he says, now you go feed them. And so now they turn around and they're looking at 10,000 people. And they have, a tiny piece of bread and a little bit of fish. We're not sure how it all happened, but as they stepped out and gave that little bit away, God supernaturally began multiplying it. And at the end of the day, everybody ate all they wanted, and then they picked up and they had 12 baskets to spare. I mean, I imagine they were just kind of blown away that this happened through them. They could have never come up with this one. See, I think the story, there's this one part in the story to me that is kind of the key phrase. It's when Jesus says to the disciples, they recognize this need that's right in front of them. And they feel this urgency and concern. Very much like Jesus felt this compassion for the crowd. They felt this towards this group of people. And then Jesus says to them, you feed them. And their plan was something else. And they never would have thought that they would be the ones that God would use to bring something supernatural to these people. And so I believe that really life as a follower of Jesus, God puts us in all these situations, and there's these moments, you know what I'm talking about? You recognize there's some need here within this particular purpose, and this particular person. And you recognize there's this need, and you realize, I feel this urgency, and so you start thinking about your own plan about how you can do that, or it's too overwhelming or whatever, but this need's kind of right in front of you. And see, I think many of those times, those God is saying to us, He wants us to be the ones to feed them spiritually. He wants us to be the ones for Him to come through and touch them in ways that we can't. That's beyond something that we can come up with. The kind of you feed them moments. Sometimes these you feed them moments are places that you feel tremendously like, this is way over my head. You know, this is way beyond me, kind of what the story was like. And I remember one time we had a pastor that was on staff, and I was an intern in California in the vineyard. And I was all new to this, praying for people. I prayed for people, but you know, I was kind of a wimp. I wasn't much of a praying person. And so I was just learning it, you know. And the pastor said, could we have a prayer meeting at your house where we pray over people? People can come with anything wrong with them, any emotional struggles, and we're just going to pray for them. And so, yeah, sure. And then he says, and also, now that we're going to have it at your house, I would like you to be one of the prayers, so one of the people pray. And I said, that's good. How many do we have? And he says, we're only going to have 4 people praying for all these people. I said, but there's a lot of people coming. Yeah, they're coming to watch. And I said, are you sure? And he felt strongly about this. So I trusted him. But man, I didn't have much faith for this. I felt so nervous. I mean, literally, and there's lots of people there. They were packed around our living room. And it was like this show, you know. And I thought, oh, what have I gotten myself into? And so then it was my turn up, and he says, why don't you and this other guy named Tom, and Tom was a great guy, but he had little emotion about things, and so he's a young guy. And so we kneel down beside this gal who's sitting there, and she is in such pain she can't even express emotion. She's just totally locked out. She's gone through all kinds of medical situations. And I'm thinking, couldn't you have given me just an easier one here, God? And so I am so desperate, and I have no idea how God could possibly come through in this situation. And there's all these people standing around waiting for me to say some dramatic thing, and this person, you know, something happens, and I have nothing to say. So I kneeled down. I just said, God, here's what the deal is. Wherever you tell me to do, I think there's some reason you have me in this crazy position, and I need you, and whatever you tell me to do, I'll do it. Just make it clear. I can't come up with anything. And God, just help me. So I was just silent. I couldn't hear anything for a long time. And all of a sudden, as I looked at this woman, I found myself feeling what God felt about her. And I can't describe how this happened, but I started feeling God's compassion for this woman. Now, I started feeling it so strongly that I was getting choked up, and I was just sitting there. And I was thinking, should I say, well, God, what do you want me to say? And there was nothing I should say. And all of a sudden I realized I just had to decide to feel what God was feeling or not. And so I started feeling what God was feeling, and I began weeping in a very embarrassing way, at a level that was very embarrassing, with all these people standing around, and there was no one else crying but me. And as I'm crying, I glance up, and this woman is not even moved. She's just looking at me. And I am sobbing, and I am feeling God's heart for this woman. And then I look over at my friend Tom, who has no emotion. He's just standing there. Thank goodness he began crying, so I wasn't alone in it. And pretty soon, lots of people began crying. And after quite a long time of that, it finally caught up with her, and she began crying. And all her emotional pain just started coming out, and God did this amazing, really good thing. You know, it was, God put me in a spot, and he wanted to use me in a way that was way beyond anything that I could have come up with. And I didn't know how to do it other than just follow the instructions that he gave me. So what I want you to think about is, what are those moments when you notice something in a person, or you're around someone and something stands out to you? Often we kind of brush those things away, or we just come up with our own plans that will fix the situation. But in those moments, oftentimes, those are moments God's saying, no, I'm up to something here, and I want you to join in with what I'm up to, and just take my step-by-step instructions, and let's see what will happen. And when we do, again, it takes us to a place that God allows us to express things of him and love people beyond their limits.